The South Pacific is not an ocean but a graveyard of forgotten names. And at its most forsaken edge, 2,500 kilometers east of Australia, 700 west of New Zealand, 400 north of the Roaring Forties, lies a volcanic splinter no larger than a London borough, ringed by cliffs that drop 200 feet into a sea that never sleeps, a place where the trade winds howl like mourning women, and the albatross circle like vultures over a battlefield yet to begin, Norfolk Island. To the Admiralty charts, it was a green comma on blue paper. To the Home Office, it was a black hole where men were posted missing, presumed reformed. To the convicts chained in the stinking holds of the transport ships, it was the final syllable of a sentence that began with guilty and ended with silence. The first time a European eye saw it in October 1774, Captain James Cook stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Resolution, rain lashing his oilskins, and wrote in his log, "A place fit only for angels and eagles, and even they would hesitate to land. The angels never came." The Eagles arrived in 1788 wearing red coats and carrying muskets, 9 weeks after the first fleet dropped anchor in Sydney Cove. Lieutenant Philip Gidley King stepped onto a beach of black volcanic sand with 23 souls, 15 convicts, 7 free men, 1 woman named Mary Rolt, who would die of fever within the year, and planted the Union Jack on a spot that would soon be known as Slaughter Bay because the surf ran red with the blood of sharks feasting on offal from the settlement's butcher yard. The soil was rich enough to grow anything except mercy. The pines grew 200 feet tall, straight as masts, perfect for the Royal Navy. The rats arrived before the humans and multiplied faster. For 37 years, the settlement limped along. Population never more than 200, food always short, scurvy always present, until 1814 when the Napoleonic Wars ended and the Navy no longer needed Norfolk pine. The buildings were torched, the livestock shot, the convicts shipped back to Sydney in chains. Silence returned, broken only by the wind and the ghosts of men who had hanged themselves from the very trees they had been sent to fell. 11 years later, in 1825, the silence was shattered again. The Home Office needed a place to bury its failures alive. The second penal era began, and with it the legend of the island that ate men. The new commandant, Major Joseph Anderson, arrived in January 1830 aboard the brig Amity, a vessel so foul with bilge and convict vomit that the rats jumped ship before the anchor was dropped. Anderson was 42, tall, thin-lipped, eyes the color of wet slate, a man who had flogged men in Barbados until their ribs showed white, hanged them in Bermuda for singing, and believed that pain was the only language the criminal class understood. On his first morning, he walked the empty parade ground, boots crunching on coral grit, and ordered the construction of a prison within a prison, a pentagonal fortress of local stone quarried by the convicts themselves, each wall 20 feet high, 3 feet thick, each cell 6 by 4, each door iron-bound Norfolk pine so dense it rang like metal when kicked. By 1835, the settlement, now called Kingston, looked like a medieval citadel dropped into paradise by a wrathful god. Barracks for 1,000 men, a hospital that could hold 50 if they were stacked like cordwood, a chapel whose bell tolled only for executions or the rare Sunday service where the hymn was always, "Nearer, my God, to thee." The lime kilns burned day and night, turning coral into mortar that hardened like bone. The quarries rang with the clang of leg irons and the thud of picks. The wind carried the smell of salt, sweat, blood, and the sweet rot of unburied bodies. Rations were calculated to the ounce by a clerk who had never gone hungry. 12 ounces of salt pork so hard it could chip teeth. 1 pound of maize meal crawling with weevils. 1 pint of water that tasted of rust and despair. Per day, per man, no exceptions. Talking earned 25 lashes. Laughing 50, looking at a guard the wrong way 100, attempting escape 200, and a month in the black hole. The cat o' nine tails was made from the hide of the island's wild cattle, each tail knotted with lead shot the size of musket balls. When it struck, the sound was not a snap but a wet explosion, and the valley echoed like a butcher's yard. One prisoner, a London pickpocket named Daniel Shea, received 300 lashes for stealing a potato that had rolled under a table. He survived. His back did not. The surgeon's report, written in a hand that trembled from gin, noted, "The spinal column is visible from scapula to sacrum." The patient was returned to work the following morning. Among the double convicts, those already serving life sentences in New South Wales or Van Diemen's Land who had re-offended, escaped or simply refused to break, were men whose names would outlive the empire that condemned them. William Westwood, 26, born in a thatched cottage in Chipping Ongar, Essex, transported at 17 for stealing a greatcoat from a church porch on a winter night when the temperature was 10 below. He had escaped 3 times from the road gangs of Van Diemen's Land, each time recaptured within a week, each time flogged until the doctor begged mercy and was ignored. On Norfolk, he was assigned to the lumber gangs, felling the giant pines that grew only here. Trees so tall their tops were lost in cloud, their trunks wide enough to hide a man. He was 5'10", wiry as fencing wire, with a scar that ran from left ear to collarbone like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh, earned when a guard's bayonet caught him during his second escape. The guards called him Jackie Jackie after the Aboriginal tracker who had betrayed him. The prisoners called him Captain because he never bowed, never begged, never looked away. Thomas Morris, 35, ex-sergeant of the 73rd Regiment of Foot, sentenced to transportation for life after striking a captain who had ordered his men to fire on unarmed rioters in Dublin during the tithe protests of 1831. Morris was sent to the quarry, a pit carved into the cliff face at Longridge where the sun never reached, and the air was thick with stone dust that turned lungs to chalk. He refused to swing a pick on his first day. "You may have my body," he told the overseer, a former prizefighter named Galway whose nose had been broken so many times it pointed sideways, "but not my obedience." They gave him 150 lashes. He still refused. Another 150 the next week. His back became a map of purple ridges and open sores. He died 3 months later, chained to the wall of the refractory cell, whispering the names of his children, Mary, Patrick, little Bridie, until his voice gave out and only blood came from his mouth. Then there were the silent ones, men whose minds had snapped like dry twigs under the weight of endless cruelty. One, known only as Irish Tommy, wandered the compound at night, digging shallow graves with his bare hands, burying stones he claimed were the bones of his brothers executed in County Cork. Another, a former schoolmaster from Bristol named Elias Hawthorne, recited Latin conjugations until his tongue swelled and split, then switched to the multiplication tables, then to the names of every king of England since Alfred, over and over until the guards beat him unconscious with the butt of a musket. Suicide was the island's quiet industry, a leap from the cliffs at Emily Bay where the water was deep and the sharks waited, a rope fashioned from strips of blanket in the rafters of the lumber shed, a shard of bottle glass stolen from the hospital and drawn across the throat in the dark. The chaplain buried them in unconsecrated ground beyond the cemetery wall, marking each grave with a number carved into a piece of coral, never a name, because names were a luxury the dead no longer needed. In the spring of 1840, a ship arrived that carried not chains but hope, a rare thing on Norfolk, rarer than fresh water. The Nautilus, a bark out of Portsmouth, dropped anchor in Sydney Bay after a passage of 112 days, and from her deck stepped Captain Alexander Maconochie, 54, Scottish abolitionist, former prisoner of war in France during the Napoleonic Wars, a man who had spent 2 years in a dungeon at Verdun and emerged believing that no soul was beyond redemption. He carried a leather folio under his arm and a letter from the colonial office appointing him commandant with full authority to experiment. His mark system was revolutionary in its simplicity. Every prisoner began with a debt of marks equal to his sentence in days. Good behavior, hard work, and education earned marks. Idleness, disobedience, or violence cost them. When the debt was paid to zero, the man walked free with a ticket of leave and a passage to Sydney. He banned the lash on his first day, doubled rations to 16 ounces of meat and a pound and a half of flour, built a schoolroom in the old hospital, where the smell of blood still lingered in the floorboards, taught reading, writing, arithmetic, even music on a battered flute he had brought from Scotland. For 4 years the island breathed a different air. Men who had not held a pen since childhood wrote letters home, some for the first time in their lives. A brass band was formed from convicts who had once played in regimental bands. They practiced in the evenings and played on Sundays after church. The notes of "The Girl I Left Behind Me" drifting across the valley and making the guards weep into their rum. A prisoner named Joseph Burns, sentenced for forgery in Manchester, composed a hymn that began, "Though chains be my lot, yet mercy is near, and God in his heaven still bends down to hear." Makanoki read it aloud at Sunday service, and the men sang it with tears running down their scarred faces. He established a library of 200 books, Dickens, Scott, the Bible, a battered copy of Robinson Crusoe, and men queued for hours to borrow them. He allowed gardens. Each prisoner could tend a small plot and eat what he grew: potatoes, cabbages, even flowers. One man, a former poacher from Devon, grew a rose that bloomed blood red and named it after his daughter he had not seen in 12 years. Makanoki's enemies in London, men who believed that convicts were a separate species, called him a sentimental fool, a dangerous radical, a man who would have the empire overrun by reformed thieves. In 1844 he was recalled. His replacement, Major Joseph Childs, arrived with a crate of new cats and nine tails, a ledger of new regulations, and a smile like a shark that has scented blood. The schoolroom became a solitary cell. The band instruments were melted down for musket balls. The hymn was forbidden on pain of 50 lashes. The gardens were plowed under. Childs posted a new regulation on every barracks door. Any man found singing, whistling, or otherwise making a joyful noise will receive 100 lashes and 7 days in the black hole. The island exhaled despair like a dying man's last breath. The winter of 1846, the population stood at 1,421 convicts, 198 soldiers and overseers, 12 women, wives of the guards who lived in constant terror of their husbands' tempers and the prisoners' eyes, and one chaplain, Reverend Thomas Rogers, 33, pale, consumptive, the son of a Norfolk parson who had preached hellfire every Sunday but had never seen it manifested in the flesh. On the island he saw it daily. He wrote in his diary, the pages smudged with salt and tears, "I have baptized men at dawn and buried them at dusk. I have heard confessions that would make Satan weep. I have seen a boy of 16 flogged until his ribs showed white through the skin." And still he smiled, because smiling was forbidden and he chose defiance over despair. Rogers tried to intercede with Childs on behalf of a man sentenced to 200 lashes for stealing a crust of bread. Childs laughed and said, "If he's hungry, let him eat his own flesh." Rogers tried again the next week for a man who had gone mad and was to be chained to a wall until he recovered his senses. Childs threatened him with transfer to a leper colony in the Moluccas. Rogers began smuggling letters off the island, hidden in the lining of his cassock, addressed to missionaries in Sydney, to bishops in London, to anyone who might listen. One reached the Times and was printed under the headline, "The Pacific Golgotha." Another reached a backbencher in Parliament named Robert Lowe, who stood up in the House of Commons and read excerpts until the Speaker ordered him to sit down. But letters took 6 months to travel by sail, and 6 months was eternity on Norfolk Island. The spark came on the evening of 30th June 1846. Childs, in a fit of economy or spite, reduced rations again. 8 ounces of pork so rancid it glowed green in the dark, half a pound of maize meal alive with weevils, water that tasted of rust, and the tears of the men who had carried it from the spring in buckets chained to their ankles. That night in the number 3 barracks, a long, low building that stank of unwashed bodies and despair, William Westwood gathered 12 men around a candle stub that flickered like a dying star. Lawrence Kavanagh, 30, Dublin forger. ink still under his fingernails from the counterfeit banknotes that had sent him to the other side of the world. Henry Porter, 28, counterfeiter from Birmingham. Soft hands, sharp mind, eyes that missed nothing. Elias Pike, 35, former Royal Navy able seaman, face tattooed with gunpowder burns from the Battle of Navarino, where he had lost 3 fingers and all faith in king and country. Billy the Rat, 24, cook, missing 3 fingers from a childhood accident with a meat cleaver, eyes that darted like a cornered animal. Black Jimmy, 32, cook's mate, shoulders like ox yokes, voice soft as a lullaby until he was angry. Samuel Prickett, 29, informer by inclination, forger by trade, the only man in the room who would betray them all before the week was out. They spoke in whispers that barely disturbed the snoring of the other 108 men in the barracks. The plan was surgical, born of desperation and months of watching guards' routines the way a cat watches a mouse hole. At the 9:30 muster, when most guards marched the lime burners to the quarry 3 miles away, the cookhouse would be left with only 2 overseers, John Galway, the prize fighter with the sideways nose, and Stephen Smith, a drunk who slept with his musket across his knees. Phase 1. Billy the Rat would accidentally overturn the cauldron of morning gruel scalding Galway's legs. Phase 2. Black Jimmy would bring the cleaver down on Galway's arm while Westwood drove a red-hot poker into Smith's thigh. Phase 3. Seize the armory keys from Galway's belt, unlock the door, distribute the 30 muskets, 12 pistols, and cutlasses left over from the Napoleonic Wars. Phase 4. Release the other compounds, take the commandant's house, secure hostages, hold the island until the brig Governor Phillip could be seized. The Governor Phillip lay at anchor in Sydney Bay, 120 tons, 6 guns, crew of 8, sails patched but seaworthy. If they could reach her, they could sail north to the New Hebrides, vanish among the cannibal islands, live as free men or die trying. If they failed, they would hang. Westwood ended the meeting with a single sentence that hung in the air like smoke. Better to hang as lions than live as dogs. Dawn, 1 July 1846. The bell clanged 5 times, a sound that scraped across the soul like a rusty blade. The air stank of salt, fear, and the copper tang of yesterday's floggings. Men stirred on plank beds no wider than coffins, scratching at lice bites, coughing up blood from lungs ruined by stone dust. In the cookhouse, a squat timber building behind the quadrangle, Billy the Rat stirred a cauldron of gray slop that was more water than maize, while Black Jimmy sharpened a cleaver on a whetstone, the scrape of steel on stone the only sound in the pre-dawn hush. At 9:17 the muster bell rang, a different note, higher, urgent. Convicts shuffled into rows on the parade ground, chains clanking, bare feet slapping on coral grit. Galway barked counts in a voice like gravel. 1, 2, 3, move, you bastards! Smith leaned on his musket, half asleep, flask of rum empty in his pocket. Westwood stood in the front row, eyes fixed on the cookhouse door, heart pounding so hard he feared the guards would hear it. He coughed twice, low, deliberate. The signal. Billy tripped. The cauldron overturned with a hiss of steam and a splash of scalding slop across Galway's boots. The overseer roared like a bull, raised his cane to strike. Black Jimmy's cleaver came down. Crack. Galway's forearm shattered, bone splintering through the skin like kindling. Westwood was already moving, grabbing the red-hot poker from the fire, driving it into Smith's thigh with a sizzle of burning flesh. The constable screamed, a high animal sound, fired his musket into the roof, plaster raining down. Now! Westwood roared, voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. 20 men erupted from the shadows where they had hidden among the flour sacks. Shivs carved from hoop iron, rocks wrapped in rags, fists hardened by years of labor. Galway tried to crawl, blood pumping from his arm. Kavanagh stomped on his neck until it snapped with a sound like a green branch breaking. Smith was on his knees begging, piss running down his leg. Westwood knelt eye to eye, voice calm as death. You flogged my mate Riley till his spine showed white. Remember Riley? He pressed the cleaver to Smith's throat. "This is for Riley." 1 slash. Blood sheeted across the dirt floor, hot and metallic. The armory keys hung from Galway's belt, slick with blood. Kavanagh snatched them, hands shaking only slightly. By 9:45, the armory was open, muskets distributed, powder and shot passed hand to hand. The prison bell was rung backwards, emergency, emergency. A sound that had not been heard since the Great Storm of 1839, when 3 ships were wrecked on the reef. Major Childs burst onto his veranda in shirt sleeves, pistol in one hand, telescope in the other, face purple with rage. "To arms! Treason, every man to his post!" But the guards were scattered, half at the quarry, a quarter drunk in their huts. The rest frozen in disbelief as convicts poured from every compound, waving captured muskets and screaming like banshees released from hell. Only 12 soldiers formed a ragged line outside the commandant's house, muskets trembling in their hands. Westwood led the charge, shirtless, blood-streaked, scar-livid in the morning sun, looking like a demon risen from the pit. For every lash, for every grave, for every man who died with his name unspoken. The first volley from the soldiers killed 3 convicts, 1 through the eye, 1 through the throat, 1 through the heart. But the rebels outnumbered them 10 to 1, 20 to 1, and they swarmed the line like wolves on a wounded stag, bayoneting, clubbing, tearing men apart with bare hands, the air thick with gunpowder and the copper stink of blood. Childs fired his pistol twice, missed both times, bullet holes appearing in the veranda post beside his head, then retreated inside, slamming the door, barricading it with a mahogany desk that had belonged to Makanoki. By 10:30, the convicts held the quadrangle, the hospital, the Protestant chapel, the lime kilns, the quartermaster's store. They smashed the flogging triangles into kindling, the wood splintering with sounds like bones breaking. They broke into the ration stores and found sacks of flour white as snow, barrels of salt pork that had not yet turned, bottles of rum sealed with red wax. Men who had not tasted real bread in years tore into loaves still warm from the oven, weeping as they ate, crumbs falling into their beards like snow into dirty wool. At 11, Westwood gathered his lieutenants in the ruined chapel, the altar cloth stained with blood from a guard who had tried to hide beneath it. The air was thick with incense and gunpowder. "We hold the island," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "But the Sirius is due in 3 days with 200 troops and a company of the 99th Regiment. We have 47 hours to take the Governor Philip and sail before they turn this place into a slaughterhouse." "Options?" Kavanagh, wiping flour from his mouth, argued for the ship. "We take the brig, sail north to Tahiti or the New Hebrides. The Navy won't chase us across the Pacific. They'll be too busy looking for us in Sydney." Elias Pike, cleaning blood from his cutlass with the altar cloth, argued for the men left behind. And abandon 1,300 brothers? The brig holds 80 at most. You'd leave them to the gallows? Henry Porter, ever the strategist, suggested negotiation. "We hold the hostages, Childs, the doctor, the chaplain, and demand pardons. Passage to America, a king's ransom in gold." Westwood listened, eyes closed, then opened them and looked at each man in turn. "We take the hostages," he said finally, "and we take the ship. But no man is left behind willingly. We burn the longboats if we must, so no pursuit can follow. We sail at dawn on the 4th, or we die here." They stormed the commandant's residence at noon, 20 men with muskets and axes, the door splintering under blows that shook the walls. Childs stood in his study, sword drawn, face pale but defiant, sideburns oiled even in extremis. "You'll hang for this, Westwood. Every last one of you."
"I'll see you dance on air." Westwood laughed.
A sound like breaking glass. "We're already dead men. Major, you just made it official." They bound Childs with the curtain cords, gagged him with his own cravat. Dr. Cunningham, the surgeon, was found hiding in the pantry, trembling so hard his teeth chattered. Reverend Rogers was dragged from the chapel where he had been praying, cassock torn, eyes wide with terror. "William," he pleaded, "this is madness." "God sees—" Westwood cut him off, voice soft as a knife. "God abandoned this island the day Makinoki sailed. Take him to the cells, iron cuffs. No food, no water. Let him pray to the rats." That afternoon they declared the Free Republic of Norfolk, a name that would live 47 hours. They elected a council in the quadrangle under a flag made from a red petticoat and a broomstick. President William Westwood, Secretary Lawrence Kavanagh, Treasurer Henry Porter, Minister for War Elias Pike, Minister for Provisions Billy the Rat. Rules were posted on the chapel door in charcoal on a flour sack. 1. No flogging, ever, on pain of death. 2. Rations equal for all, no exceptions. 3. Any man who harms a hostage answers to the council. Bright we sail at dawn on the 4th if the brig is taken. Any man who wishes to stay may do so, but the longboats will be burned. That night bonfires burned in the quadrangle, built from the smashed flogging, frames and the commandant's furniture. Men sang Irish rebel songs, The Rising of the Moon, Roddy McCorley, voices hoarse but defiant, drank rum until the barrels ran dry, danced jigs on the graves of overseers they had buried in shallow pits along the cliff path. A man named O'Leary, a former piper from County Kerry, played a lament on a flute carved from a human thigh bone, whose thigh no one asked. But cracks appeared even in victory. Some men, drunk on rum and power, wanted revenge immediate and bloody. A gang of 20, led by a hulking forger named Mad Dog Malone, dragged Constable Morris from his hiding place in the lime kiln where he had been cowering since dawn. They tied him to the flogging post with his own belt, stripped him to the waist, and gave him 300 lashes with his own cat-o'-nine tails, counting each stroke aloud, laughing when the tails stuck in the flesh and had to be pulled free. Morris screamed until his voice gave out, then whimpered, then hung silent, a sack of meat and bone. Westwood arrived too late, musket in hand, face twisted with rage. "This is what we fought to end. This is the old world, not the new. The next man who raises a lash answers to me with a bullet." He ordered Morris cut down and buried with the others, but the damage was done. The Republic was already rotting from within. Day 2, 2nd July, dawned gray and sullen, the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Not all convicts had joined the rebellion. About 300, mostly old lags who had been on the island since Anderson's time. Men broken so completely they feared freedom more than the lash, barricaded themselves in the Long Ridge Agricultural Station 3 miles inland, a cluster of stone barns and a defensible hill surrounded by pineapple fields. They had muskets, food, water, and a leader named Old Daddy Johnson, a former highwayman who had survived 200 lashes over 20 years and walked with a limp that made him look like a broken marionette. Westwood sent Kavanagh with 50 men to parley under a white flag made from a surgeon's apron. Johnson shouted from behind a stone wall, "We ain't dying for your madness, Jackie. You've had your fun. Now go back to your rum and your whores and leave us be." Kavanagh tried reason, then threats, then promises of passage on the brig. Johnson spat and fired a musket over their heads. Negotiations failed. At dusk, Westwood ordered the attack. 50 men against 300, but the rebels had surprise and desperation. They advanced through the pineapple fields, the spiked leaves tearing at their legs, muskets cracking in the twilight. A rebel named Tommy Flynn took a ball through the gut and died screaming, clutching his intestines like wet rope. Another, a boy of 17 named Jamie Kerr, had his jaw shattered by a ramrod and lived long enough to beg his mother's forgiveness in a voice like wet gravel. After 2 hours of fire and bayonet work, the Long Ridge men surrendered on condition they be allowed to sail to Sydney as witnesses, not participants. Westwood agreed, but he took their muskets, their powder, their food, and their boots. "You'll walk to the jetty," he said, "and count every step as a blessing." Night of 2nd July, in the hospital, a long room with a dirt floor and a roof that leaked like a sieve. Dr. Cunningham treated the wounded under lantern light, his hands steady despite the pistol Kavanagh held to his head. Among the patients was Samuel Prickett, the informer, who had taken a bayonet graze to the thigh during the Long Ridge fight. Prickett, sweating and feverish, whispered to Cunningham when Kavanagh stepped out to piss, "Westwood plans to burn the Governor Philip at anchor to prevent pursuit. He's keeping the longboats for his inner circle, 12 men, maybe 15. The rest are bait to hold the troops when they land." He told Pike in the chapel. I heard him. Cunningham, whose Hippocratic oath warred with his terror, passed the message to Childs through a loyal nurse named Martha Grady, the only woman on the island who had not gone mad. Childs, chained to a wall in the refractory cell, smiled for the first time in days, teeth white against his blood-crusted beard. "Then we wait. The Navy will come, and Westwood will hang from the yardarm he dreamed of sailing under." July 1846, 4 a.m. Fog blanketed the island like a shroud, thick enough to choke a man, muffling sound turning the world to gray. The Governor Philip rocked gently at anchor in Sydney Bay, her riding lights faint stars in the mist, guarded by 6 sailors who had drunk themselves senseless on the captain's private stock of Jamaican rum. Westwood's plan was elegant in its simplicity. 20 men in 2 whaleboats row silently through the fog, board from the seaward side, overpower the crew before they could fire a signal gun, cut the anchor cable, sail north under cover of darkness. They launched from a hidden cove below the cliffs, oars muffled with rags, the only sound the slap of waves and the creak of rowlocks. But the Navy had been warned. Amos Fly, a 28-gun sloop under Captain Oliver Fitzroy, had left Sydney the moment the first signal fire was sighted on Norfolk's highest peak, a fire lit by a loyalist who had escaped Longridge in the chaos. Fly arrived under cover of fog, guns run out, Marines in the tops with muskets primed. At 4:47 a.m. the silence shattered. A cannon boomed, the sound rolling across the water like God's own judgment. The first shot, a 32-pound ball, smashed the Governor Philip's mainmast, splinters scything through the air like shrapnel, cutting down 3 rebels in the lead whaleboat. Grapeshot followed, turning the water to red foam. The second whaleboat capsized under the weight of dead and dying. Westwood, on the cliff path above, saw the flash through the fog and knew. "Treachery!" he roared, voice carrying to the stars. Marines stormed ashore at Bloody Bridge, bayonets fixed, drums beating the advance. The rebellion, which had begun with a cleaver in a cookhouse, ended in 47 hours amid the screams of the wounded and the smell of burning powder. The trials were swift, held in the chapel under a portrait of King William IV that had somehow survived the uprising. Captain MacArthur of the Fly presided, flanked by 2 lieutenants and a clerk who wrote in a hand that never trembled. The prisoners were brought in chains, 12 at a time, barefoot, shirtless, eyes hollow. Westwood refused to beg, refused to name names, refused even to sit. "I regret nothing but that we failed," he said, voice steady, scar livid in the lantern light. "If I had 10 lives, I'd give them all to see this island burn and every chain in the empire melted into plowshares." He was sentenced to hang with 11 others: Kavanagh, Pike, Porter, Billy the Rat, Black Jimmy, 6 more whose names history swallowed. Samuel Prickett turned King's evidence and was pardoned, sent to Sydney with a new name and a purse of gold. On 13th of October 1846, a perfect spring day with the pines whispering in the breeze, the gallows were erected on the parade ground where Maconochie had once taught men to read. The 12 were hanged in 2 groups of 6, the trap dropping with a sound like a judge's gavel. Westwood was last. As the noose was placed around his neck, he looked out over the assembled convicts, 400 men forced to watch, and shouted, "Tell them in England, we were men, not beasts. Tell them the blood of Norfolk cries out." The trap fell. His body swung, twitched, was still. The bodies were buried in unconsecrated ground beneath the pines. No markers, no prayers, only the wind and the ants. The rebellion crushed. Norfolk returned to silence. But the silence was different now, haunted. Reports reached London within months, 400 lashes in a single month, 17 suicides in a single week, a boy of 14 flogged to death for stealing a biscuit, a man chained to a wall for 3 weeks until his legs rotted off. In 1853, a parliamentary committee under Sir William Molesworth declared the secondary punishment system a disgrace to a Christian nation, and recommended immediate closure. The order came in March 1855. Norfolk Island would be abandoned. The remaining 194 convicts, those who had not died, escaped, or gone mad, were transferred to Tasmania aboard the Lady Franklin, a ship that stank of despair and human waste. When the last transport sailed away on 8 May 1855, the settlement was silent. The gallows stood empty, ropes frayed by the wind. The cells were rotting, doors hanging from hinges like broken jaws. The ocean wind erased footprints from the sand, but it could not erase the blood soaked into the coral. In June 1856, the first Pitcairn Islanders arrived, descendants of the Bounty mutineers and their Tahitian wives, 194 souls seeking a new home. They found paradise and nightmare in equal measure. They built houses from the prison stones, planted gardens where men had once been flogged, turned the chapel into a school. But the bones remained. Children playing in the quarries found leg irons fused to tibias. Women digging gardens unearthed skulls with bullet holes. The wind at night carried voices. Some said prayers, some said curses, some said names. Today, 11 November 2025, Norfolk Island is a tranquil tourist destination of 2,000 souls. Golden beaches, swaying Norfolk pines, coral reefs teeming with fish. A duty-free paradise where the only chains are on the bicycles tourists rent to explore the ruins. But Kingston is still there, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the pentagonal prison a moss-covered skeleton, cells where men screamed now home to swallows and spiders. Visitors walk the parade ground and feel cold spots where the temperature drops 10 degrees for no reason. They stand in the refractory cell and hear whispers they cannot place. They picnic at Emily Bay and do not swim too far out, because the locals say the sharks remember. Archaeologists in the 21st century found iron leg cuffs fused to bone in a mass. Grave, a child's leather shoe perfectly preserved in the lime kiln, a letter hidden in a wall cavity, written in charcoal on a scrap of flour sack. If you read this, remember us. We were not monsters. We were broken. W. Westwood, 1st July 1846. In 2025, a memorial stands where the gallows once stood, a simple stone slab with an inscription carved deep. Here, men were unmade. Let their pain teach mercy. The wind still carries names: Westwood, Morris, Kavanagh, Billy the Rat, Black Jimmy, the silent ones, the 194 who sailed away, the thousands who never left. On quiet nights when the moon is full and the pines whisper, you can hear them if you listen. The crack of the lash, the creak of the gallows, the song of men who dreamed of freedom and woke to chains. Norfolk Island remembers, and so must we.